Wyoming takes a hands-off approach to rent increases that's consistent with the state's overall philosophy of minimal government regulation. If you manage rental property in Wyoming, you have broad freedom to set and raise rent, but there are still rules you need to follow to do it properly. Wyoming does not have any form of rent control or rent stabilization. There is no state statute that limits how much a landlord can increase rent, how often rent can be raised, or that requires landlords to justify the amount of an increase. The state legislature has never enacted rent control legislation, and there is no indication that such legislation is being seriously considered. Wyoming's political and regulatory environment strongly favors property rights and market-based pricing. This means that as a Wyoming landlord, you can raise the rent by any amount: 5%, 20%, 50%, as long as you follow the proper notice requirements and the increase isn't motivated by an illegal purpose. For month-to-month tenancies, the rent increase takes effect through the standard termination and renewal process. Because Wyoming doesn't have a comprehensive Landlord-Tenant Act with specific rent increase provisions, the general rule is that the landlord must provide notice equal to the rental period, typically 1 full month's notice for a monthly tenancy. You're essentially modifying the terms of the tenancy, and that requires proper advance notice. The notice should be in writing, should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the date the increase takes effect. While Wyoming doesn't mandate a specific statutory form for rent increase notices, putting it in writing protects both parties and creates a clear record if a dispute arises later. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term. The landlord cannot raise the rent during the middle of a fixed-term lease unless the lease itself includes a provision allowing mid-term increases, such as an escalation clause or a clause tied to specific triggers like property tax increases. Without such a provision, the landlord must wait until the lease expires and negotiate a new rent amount as part of a new lease or renewal. This is an important planning consideration for Wyoming landlords. If you're signing a 1-year lease and you anticipate that costs, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, will increase during that year, you should either build the anticipated increase into the initial rent or include a lease provision that allows for adjustments. Once the lease is signed without such a provision, you're locked in until the term expires. Now let's talk about the limits that do exist, because even without rent control, Wyoming landlords cannot raise rent for just any reason. The most important restriction is that rent increases cannot be retaliatory. While Wyoming doesn't have a detailed anti-retaliation statute the way some states do, courts recognize that a landlord cannot raise the rent in retaliation for a tenant exercising their legal rights. If a tenant files a complaint about habitability with a government agency, reports a code violation, or exercises any other legal right, and the landlord responds by dramatically increasing the rent, the tenant may have grounds to challenge the increase as retaliatory. A court evaluating such a claim would look at the timing of the increase relative to the tenant's protected activity, the magnitude of the increase, and whether the landlord can demonstrate a legitimate business reason for the change. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and Wyoming's own fair housing laws, a landlord cannot raise rent based on the tenant's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. If a landlord raises rent for one tenant but not another in a comparable unit, and the only apparent difference between the two tenants is a protected characteristic, the landlord could face a fair housing complaint. Keeping rent increase decisions consistent, documented, and tied to legitimate business factors, like market rates, operating cost increases, and property improvements, is the best way to protect yourself against discrimination claims. Wyoming also has general consumer protection principles that prohibit fraud and deceptive practices. A landlord who misrepresents the reason for a rent increase, for example, claiming that property taxes doubled when they actually stayed the same, could face legal consequences under Wyoming's consumer protection statute. From a practical standpoint, Wyoming's rental market varies significantly across the state. In Cheyenne and Casper, the state's two largest cities, the rental market is relatively stable and competitive, and rent increases generally track with broader market trends. In western Wyoming, particularly Teton County and the Jackson Hole area, rents are extraordinarily high due to the combination of a desirable location, limited buildable land, and a tourism-driven economy. Landlords in the Jackson area can command premium rents, but the market is also sensitive to economic fluctuations tied to the tourism and recreation industries. In the oil and gas regions of northeastern Wyoming, around Gillette and the Powder River Basin, rental prices have historically been tied to energy industry activity. During boom periods, demand spikes and rents rise rapidly. During downturns, vacancies increase and landlords may need to lower rents to attract tenants. Understanding these local market dynamics helps Wyoming landlords set appropriate rent levels and time increases strategically. One best practice for Wyoming landlords, even though the law doesn't require it, is to provide as much advance notice as possible for significant rent increases. While 1 month's notice is the legal minimum for monthly tenancies, providing 60 or 90 days notice for large increases gives tenants time to adjust their budgets or make alternative arrangements. This approach reduces turnover, maintains good landlord-tenant relationships, and decreases the likelihood of disputes. Another best practice is to document the business reasons for each rent increase. Keep records of comparable market rents in your area, track your operating cost increases, and note any property improvements you've made that justify a higher rent. This documentation serves two purposes. It protects you against any future claim of retaliation or discrimination, and it helps you make informed decisions about pricing your units competitively. For the complete guide to Wyoming rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our Landlord Tenant Law series.